Welcome to Relaxing Revenge Storytelling. I'm your host, and tonight's story is a real treat.
My name is Renee Whitfield. I'm 36 years old, and on the fourth Thursday of last November, in my mother's dining room in Savannah, Georgia, my business partner stood up with a champagne flute in her hand and thanked my mother for making the transition so smooth. I was seated at the far end of the table with a forkful of cornbread dressing halfway to my mouth. I remember the exact weight of the fork. I remember the candlelight flickering against the rim of Helena's glass. I remember the precise second the word transition entered the air and rearranged every molecule in the room. I set the fork down. I asked very quietly, "What transition?" The table went silent in a way that I have only ever experienced twice in my life, and the first time was when my father died. My mother's hand went to her pearls. Helena's smile froze in place like a photograph that had been left out in the sun too long. My sister Colleen, 2 seats away, set her wine glass down so carefully it made no sound. Somewhere in the kitchen, a timer was beeping for the pies. And in that silence, I understood 3 things at once. I understood that I had been robbed. I understood that the person who had loaded the gun was sitting across from me wearing the necklace I bought her for Mother's Day. And I understood that everything I was about to do next, I was going to have to do alone, in secret, and with the cold precision of a woman who had finally run out of forgiveness. But before I tell you what happened next, please take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment with the city you're listening from. This channel is built for people who have been the workhorse in someone else's story, the ones who held the household together while the credit went somewhere else, and I want to know you're out there. If you've ever been the one everybody depended on and nobody actually thanked, you are exactly who I'm telling this to. Welcome back to our channel. Stay with me, because what happened between that Thanksgiving dinner and the morning I walked out of my own clinic for the last time is a story about how a woman builds her own door when every door she was given has been locked from the outside. To understand how I got to that dining room, you have to go back 12 years to a single treatment room in a strip mall off Abercorn Street. I opened the clinic when I was 24 years old with $11,000 in savings and a physical therapy license that was barely a year old. The first treatment table I owned, I assembled myself with an Allen wrench on a Sunday afternoon. The first patient I ever treated was a retired high school football coach with a torn rotator cuff who paid me in cash because his insurance hadn't kicked in yet. I cried in my car after he left because, for the first time in my life, somebody had paid me for what I knew instead of what I could carry. Within 4 years, I had 3 treatment rooms. Within 7, I had a second location across the river in Pooler. By the time I was 33, Whitfield Sports Rehabilitation was billing $1.2 million a year, employing 14 people and serving most of the collegiate athletic programs within an hour's drive. I built the intake algorithm myself in the evenings after my staff went home. I built the billing reconciliation system. I built the patient progression protocols. I built the referral network, 1 orthopedic surgeon at a time, 1 handshake at a time, 1 Saturday morning at a community 5K where I handed out free shoulder assessments at a folding table. Helena Pruitt came into my life 4 years ago. She was a marketing consultant with an MBA from Emory and a smile that could disarm a hostage negotiator. She had been hired by a colleague's practice in Charleston to manage their growth, and she had taken a small regional outfit and tripled its revenue in 18 months. When she pitched me on becoming a partner, bringing in capital, formalizing operations, building the brand, she sat across from me at a coffee shop on Bull Street and said, "Renee, you've built something extraordinary, but you're the bottleneck. Let me free you up to do what only you can do." That sentence, "let me free you up." I have replayed it in my head so many times since that I can taste the cinnamon in the cortado I was drinking when she said it, because nothing in my life has ever been less true. She did not free me. She used my freedom as the chisel she planned to use against me. I sold her 30% of the company. She paid for it with a loan she secured against her husband's pediatric dental practice in Bluffton. The papers were signed on a Tuesday in March. My mother attended the signing. My mother, Judith Whitfield, who has spent the entirety of my life convinced that her younger daughter was put on this earth to do the work that nobody else wanted to do, came to the lawyer's office that day and hugged Helena and called her, and I quote, "the answer to my prayers." I should have heard the bell ringing then. I didn't. I was 32, exhausted, and stupid with hope. My mother is a particular kind of woman. She is the kind who polishes her silverware before her own daughter comes for dinner because she wants the table to look impressive. But she will not pay for her daughter's wedding because, and these were her actual words, "You've always been the practical one, Renee. You'll figure it out." My sister Colleen got the wedding at the Ford plantation. My sister Colleen got the down payment on the Hilton Head house. My sister Colleen got the trust fund our grandmother left, the one our mother quietly redirected because, and again I quote, "Colleen needs it more. You've always been able to take care of yourself." When I was 9 years old, my mother told a neighbor on our front porch while I was sitting 2 feet away pretending to read that I was her mule. She used that word. She said, "Colleen is the show pony, but Renee is the mule. She'll just keep pulling." The neighbor laughed. My mother laughed. I sat there holding a paperback copy of A Wrinkle in Time and learned at 9 years old that the word for what I was had 4 letters and lived in a barn. I have spent 27 years of my life trying to disprove that word. I have built a business worth more than my mother and sister combined will ever earn. I have employed 14 people, supported their families, paid for their kids' braces and their health insurance and their maternity leaves. I have never missed a mortgage payment, never overdrawn an account, never asked my mother for a single dollar. And on the night before Thanksgiving, I drove to her house in Ardsley Park with a bottle of Pinot Noir and a dish of sweet potatoes and walked into a dining room where my business partner had been invited as an honored guest, and I was the only person at the table who didn't know what the celebration was actually for. The first thing I want you to understand is that I am not stupid. I am not naive. I am not one of those people who missed the warning signs because I was too trusting. I am the woman who reads contracts twice and runs background checks on new hires and keeps her own books in a parallel ledger because she does not believe in single points of failure. And still, this happened to me. Because the people closest to you, the people who share your DNA and your last name, those people are the one blind spot that competence cannot protect you from. The escalation, when I trace it backward now, started in June. That was when my mother began having lunch with Helena every Tuesday at a place called the Old Pink House downtown. I knew about the lunches because Helena mentioned them, casually, in the way you mention something you want to seem above board. "Your mom and I are getting coffee," she'd say, or "Judith and I had the loveliest lunch. She's such a treasure." I told myself it was sweet. My mother had always been cold toward my work, indifferent toward my staff, dismissive of my accomplishments. If she was finally taking an interest, even through the back door of my business partner, maybe something had thawed. What was actually happening at those lunches, I would not learn until months later. My mother was coaching Helena on what she called taking more ownership. She was telling Helena that I worked too hard, that I didn't know how to delegate, that I was the kind of person who needed to be relieved of responsibility because I would never let go of it voluntarily. She was, in essence, providing Helena with the psychological blueprint for how to dismantle my authority while convincing herself she was doing it for my own good. In July, Helena signed a vendor contract without my approval. It was a supplier renegotiation for our electrotherapy equipment, and the terms she signed violated an existing exclusivity clause with a different supplier, triggering $23,000 in penalties. When I confronted her, she put her hand on my arm and said, "Renee, I was trying to save us money. I'm so sorry. I should have looped you in. It won't happen again." I accepted the apology because the alternative was acknowledging that my partner had just cost me $23,000 and felt entitled to do it without asking. In August, she hired her cousin as office manager at $62,000 a year. No job posting, no interview process, no conversation with me. I came in on a Monday morning and there was a woman named Brittany at the front desk wearing a Whitfield Sports Rehabilitation polo shirt I had not authorized her to wear. When I asked Helena what was happening, she laughed and said, "Oh, I meant to tell you, Brittany is incredible. You're going to love her." Brittany had no medical office experience. Brittany could not pronounce the names of half our medications. Within 3 weeks, Brittany had double booked 17 patients and lost a referral relationship I had spent 2 years building. In September, 3 of my longest tenured staff members resigned within a single week. Each one came to me privately, on her way out, and told me the same thing. Helena had been telling them I was stepping back for health reasons, that I was overwhelmed, that I was, and one of them used this exact phrase, having some kind of breakdown. I sat in my office after the 3rd resignation and felt my jaw lock so tightly that when I went to my dentist the following week, he asked me if I had been in a car accident. I told him no. I did not tell him that I was being slowly murdered professionally by my own business partner while my mother held the knife steady. In October, my sister Colleen called me from Hilton Head. We had not spoken in 4 months. Her voice was careful, the way you talk to someone who has just been diagnosed with something serious. She said, "Renee, Mom told me you're having a breakdown. She said you can't handle the clinic anymore. Do you need me to come manage it for a while? I could leave the kids with Brad and come down for a month." I sat on the kitchen floor of my own house, surrounded by groceries I had not unpacked, and listened to my sister offer to take over a business she has never set foot in, and I understood for the first time that the lie about me was not contained. The lie had been broadcast. The lie was now a family fact. And then, in early November, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I found the email. I was logged into the clinic's shared accounting portal looking for a vendor invoice. The portal aggregates emails sent through clinic accounts, and Helena had used her clinic email to correspond with my mother because, I would later understand, she wanted there to be a paper trail that looked official. I was scrolling through invoices when the subject line caught my eye. It said simply, "Renee." I clicked it without thinking. And there it was, in my mother's writing, sent from her personal Gmail to Helena's clinic address. "Don't worry about Renee. She'll accept it once it's done. She always does." I read that sentence 11 times. I sat at my desk in my own office in the building I had built, and I read those words 11 times, and on the 11th reading, something in my chest went very still. Not loud, not dramatic. Just still, the way a room goes still when the air conditioner finally shuts off and you realize how loud it had been running. She always does. That was the moment. That was the morning my mother had been waiting for my entire life. The morning she would do something to me and assume I would absorb it the way I had absorbed every other thing, the way the mule absorbs the harness without complaint. And in that stillness, in that very small and very quiet moment, I made the decision that everything that followed would be built on. I was not going to accept it. I was not going to confront her. I was not going to scream. I was not going to demand explanations or stage a tearful intervention or threaten to cut anyone off. Those were the responses she expected. Those were the responses she had prepared for. Those were, in fact, the responses that the word breakdown had been carefully seeded to discredit in advance. I was going to do something she had never seen me do in 36 years. I was going to plan. I closed the email. I closed the portal. I went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, returned to my desk, and finished my afternoon patient sessions with a smile so even and warm that one of my regulars, an elderly woman with chronic lower back pain, told me I looked rested. I drove home that evening, made dinner, watched 20 minutes of a cooking show, and went to sleep. And the next morning, at 5:45, I sat down at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a black pen, and I began to map my exit. The first call I made was to Margaret Chen. Margaret has been my accountant since the second year of the clinic. She is 61 years old, Taiwanese American, a Georgia Tech graduate, and she runs her practice out of a small office on Habersham Street with 2 associates and a cat named Spreadsheet. Margaret does not waste words. Margaret does not miss decimals. And Margaret, I had long suspected, missed nothing else either. I called her at 7 in the morning. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "Margaret, I need to come see you today. It cannot wait." She said, "Be here at 8:30. I'll cancel my 9. When I walked into her office at 8:28, she closed the door behind me, sat down across from me, folded her hands on her desk, and said, "Renee, I've been waiting for this conversation for 3 months." I want you to understand what she said next because it is one of the most important moments of my life. Margaret had been noticing things since August. She had flagged the unauthorized vendor contract. She had flagged Brittany's salary, which had been processed without an executed offer letter. She had flagged a series of small expenditures on the clinic's operating account that had been authorized through Helena's signature alone. She had said nothing to me because she was not certain. And because she was not certain, she had instead done what any forensic accountant of her caliber does when she suspects something is wrong but lacks proof. She had been documenting. For 3 months, Margaret had been quietly building a secured cloud folder containing every anomaly she had identified. 247 entries as of the morning I walked into her office, screenshots, PDFs, bank statement reconciliations, vendor email correspondence she had pulled through her authorized access. Every entry timestamped, sourced, and cross-referenced. She had not told me because she did not want to alarm me before she understood the shape of what she was looking at. And she had been waiting patiently for me to come to her on my own. I sat in her office for 3 hours that morning. We did not speak the entire time. She turned her monitor to face me and I scrolled through her folder, entry by entry. When I got to the forged equipment lease, $180,000 signed in October, my mother's signature next to a line that should have had mine, my hands went cold, literally cold. The temperature in my fingers dropped so suddenly I had to wrap them around Margaret's coffee mug just to feel something other than ice. She removed her glasses. She set down her pen. She said, Renee, this is worse than I told you. The lease has a 90-day contestation window. After December 15th, it becomes binding on the clinic, regardless of how it was signed. We have 6 weeks. 6 weeks. I want you to feel the weight of that number because it became the metronome of everything that came next. 6 weeks to copy every document I would need. 6 weeks to set up a parallel infrastructure. 6 weeks to identify which of my 14 staff members would follow me and which were already loyal to the version of me Helena had been selling them. 6 weeks to find a new location, secure a lease, transfer my licensing, notify my patient base in a way that would not trigger a legal counterattack. 6 weeks to do all of this while continuing to walk into the clinic every morning, smile at Helena, perform the role of the oblivious workhorse who would, as my mother had so confidently predicted, accept it once it was done. I walked out of Margaret's office at 11:15. The Savannah sun was warm on Habersham Street. A woman walked past me with a stroller. I sat down on a bench across from the office and breathed, just breathed, for 10 full minutes, because the magnitude of what I had just learned and what I had just decided to do was, for those 10 minutes, larger than my body could hold. And then I got up, got in my car, drove to a UPS store on Victory Drive that I had never been to before, and I rented a private mailbox under my own name with cash. That was the first physical act of my exit. A mailbox, $28 a month, an address that nobody in my life knew existed. By the end of that week, I had opened a business checking account at a credit union in Pooler that I had never banked with before, in the name of a single-member LLC I had formed online for $95. I had toured 3 commercial spaces with a commercial real estate broker named Cynthia Reyes, whom I had selected because she had no connection to anyone in my mother's social circle, and whose office was a 30-minute drive from the clinic. I had downloaded onto a personal external hard drive that I purchased at a Best Buy in Pooler with cash, a complete encrypted backup of every protocol, algorithm, template, and patient education document I had personally authored over 12 years. Tens of thousands of files, my intellectual property, the actual operational engine of the business. And every morning at 7:30, I walked through the front door of Whitfield Sports Rehabilitation with 2 coffees and a cardboard carrier, one for the front desk, one for me, and I smiled at Helena and asked her how her weekend was, and I listened to her tell me about a brunch she had with my mother, and I did not flinch, did not blink, did not give her a single tell that anything had shifted inside me. The dual life. That is what Margaret called it the second time I went to her office 3 days later. She said, "You're going to be living 2 lives for the next 6 weeks, Renee. You need to know that the body keeps score of that kind of thing. Sleep when you can, eat when you can, and do not, under any circumstances, talk about this to anyone outside this office." I nodded. I did not tell her about the headaches. I did not tell her about the way my hands had begun to tremble very faintly when I held a coffee cup with my right hand. I did not tell her that I had begun grinding my teeth so violently in my sleep that I woke up with my jaw aching and the taste of blood in my mouth. The first, almost caught moment happened in the second week. Helena came into my office on a Wednesday afternoon, closed the door behind her, sat down in the chair across from my desk, and said, "Renee, I want to give you my full accounting access for the next quarter. I think it's important that we have full transparency on both sides, and Margaret has been so accommodating. I'd love to see what she sees." She smiled when she said it, the same warm, disarming smile she had used 4 years ago at the coffee shop on Bull Street. My hands went cold again, because Margaret's accounting access was the same portal that contained the secured cloud folder. The folder had 247 entries documenting Helena's own crimes. If Helena gained full access, she would, within hours, discover that she was being investigated. I smiled back. I said, "That's such a generous offer, Helena. Thank you. Let me talk to Margaret about whether her system can accommodate dual administrator access. I want to make sure we don't accidentally lock ourselves out of anything critical." I made a note on a Post-it. I attached the Post-it to my monitor. I said, "I'll have an answer for you by Friday." She left my office. I waited 4 minutes after the door closed. Then I picked up my cell phone and texted Margaret a single word: "Now." Margaret called me back in 90 seconds. I told her what had happened. She did not panic. She said, "Give me 4 hours." 4 hours later, the secured folder had been migrated to an entirely separate cloud account, owned by Margaret's firm, accessible only through 2-factor authentication on Margaret's personal phone. The folder that Helena would theoretically be granted access to, the one that lived in the clinic's accounting system, contained only what it was supposed to contain. The clinic's books, clean and orderly and unremarkable. On Friday, I went to Helena's office and told her Margaret had set up dual access. Helena hugged me. She actually hugged me in her office with the door open, and her perfume smelled like the lavender hand soap my mother kept in the powder room in Ardsley Park, and I held my arms around her shoulders and counted to 4 and let go. I drove home that night and sat in my driveway for 45 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I called Margaret. I said, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." Margaret said, 4 more weeks? You can do 4 more weeks. You have done harder things." I did not know what harder things she was referring to. I trusted her enough to believe she was right. The second almost caught moment came at the very end of October. I had been moving small items from my office at the clinic to a storage unit I had rented in Garden City, a few frame certifications, an external monitor, a backup of my patient files on an encrypted drive. I moved them on Wednesdays after my last patient in a tote bag that looked like it held nothing but laundry. On the third Wednesday, Helena's cousin Brittany walked into the parking lot just as I was loading the tote into my trunk. She said, "What you got there, Doc?" I smiled and said, "Gym clothes. I'm finally going back to the YMCA. Wish me luck." Brittany laughed and waved and kept walking to her own car. I waited until she pulled out of the lot. Then I locked my trunk. Then I sat in the driver's seat and cried for 6 full minutes with both hands pressed against my mouth so that no sound would escape into the parking lot of my own clinic. It was the next morning that I heard the voicemail. Helena had a habit of leaving voice messages on the clinic's shared phone system for the front desk staff, who would then transcribe them and email them to the appropriate person. She had left a message on a Tuesday evening that, due to a system error nobody had noticed, had been saved twice, once in the front desk inbox and once in the general voicemail folder that I, as the senior partner, had administrative access to. The transcription had only been generated for the front desk version. The original audio sat in the general folder, undeleted, untranscribed, for 6 days. I found it on a Thursday morning at 6:15, drinking coffee at my kitchen table, scrolling through the system to check overnight messages. I clicked play out of habit, not curiosity. I want you to hear what I heard, because the body remembers a voice it has trusted when that voice says the thing it has actually been thinking. Helena's voice, casual, talking to someone in the background. The someone was my mother. They were apparently on speaker. Helena said, "Judith, I'm telling you, it's going to be fine. She'll cool down. She always does. She built it, but she doesn't have the personality to run it. Some people are workers and some people are owners. Renee will always be the mule." The mule, the word my mother used when I was 9 years old. The word that had traveled over 27 years from the front porch in Ardsley Park to the speakerphone of my own business partner's car, where the two of them, my mother and my partner, were apparently having a conversation about how reliably I would absorb the violation of everything I had built. I sat at my kitchen table and listened to that voicemail 4 times. I did not cry. I did not shake. I downloaded the audio file to my personal computer, then to my external hard drive, then to a USB drive that I locked in the glove compartment of my car. I emailed the file to Margaret. I emailed it to myself at 3 different addresses. And then I sat very still and watched the sun come up over my fence line, and I understood that the question was no longer whether I would survive my exit. The question was now whether they would survive mine. My sister Colleen flew into Savannah on the first weekend of November. I had not invited her. I had not told her anything. She showed up at my front door on a Saturday morning at 9:15 with a small overnight bag and a face that looked like she had not slept. When I opened the door, she said, "Helena left a voicemail. It got forwarded to me. I don't know how. Mom is losing her mind. Can I come in?" I stepped aside. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table where 4 weeks earlier I had drafted my first exit map, and my sister, the show pony, the one who got the wedding and the trust in the house on Hilton Head, looked at me and said the sentence that has rewritten the entire history of my relationship with my family. She said, "I spent 20 years being Mom's trophy, and you spent 20 years being her engine. I'm done watching her take you apart. Whatever you need, I'm here." I want you to know that I did not believe her for the first 90 seconds. I waited for the angle. I waited for the request. I waited for the version of help that was actually a way of taking over. None of it came. What came instead was my sister, crying very quietly into a paper towel, telling me that she had known for a long time that something was wrong, that our mother had been making oblique comments about Helena and the clinic that did not add up, that she had been afraid to call me because she knew she had not earned the right to be trusted, and that the voicemail had broken something in her that she did not want to put back together. I told her everything. I sat at that table for 4 hours and walked her through every entry in Margaret's folder, every step of the exit plan, every detail of the timeline. She listened. She did not interrupt. She kept her hands wrapped around the same mug of coffee until the coffee was cold and a thin film had gathered on the surface. When I got to the forged lease, she put a hand over her mouth. When I played her the voicemail, she closed her eyes. When I was finished, she said, "What can I do?" I said, "I need you at Thanksgiving. I need you in the room. I need you to watch." She nodded. She said, "I'll be there." The 3rd week of November was the hardest. The final preparations. The signed lease on the new location, a clean, white-walled space in a medical complex on Eisenhower Drive with 3 treatment rooms and a small reception area, 3 miles from the original clinic. The completed business filings. The new credentialing applications with every major insurer. The quiet conversations with 9 of my 14 staff members conducted one at a time, over coffee at locations far from the clinic where I laid out the situation and the timeline and asked them if they wanted to come with me. All 9 said yes. 2 of them cried. One of them, my lead athletic trainer, a woman named Yolanda who has worked with me for 8 years, said, "Renee, I've been waiting for you to ask. I would have followed you out the door 6 months ago if you told me you were leaving." The week of Thanksgiving, Helena brought me flowers. She walked into my office on the Monday before Thanksgiving carrying a small bouquet of yellow ranunculus and a handwritten card. The card said in her looping handwriting, "Renee, I couldn't do this without you. So grateful for our partnership. Helena." I thanked her. I put the flowers in a glass on my desk. I left them there for the rest of the week. I watched them slowly wilt, petal by petal, while she sat in the office next door planning the toast she would deliver at my mother's dining room table. The night before Thanksgiving, I lay in bed in my own house and could not sleep. I got up at 2 in the morning, walked into my kitchen, made a cup of chamomile tea, and stood at the window looking out at my backyard. The crepe myrtles had dropped most of their leaves. There was a thin moon over the roof of my neighbor's house. The refrigerator clicked on behind me, then off again, and the silence that came after it was the same silence I had felt the day I read my mother's email. I thought about the next 24 hours. I thought about my mother, asleep in her bed across town, planning her menu, planning her seating chart, planning the moment when her daughter would, as predicted, accept it. I thought about the brass key. When I signed my first lease 12 years ago in a strip mall on Abercorn Street, I had a single brass key cut at a hardware store on Liberty Street. It was the first key I had ever owned to a space that belonged to me. I had carried that key on my keychain for 12 years. It had been copied over the years into a master set of 8 keys for various doors and cabinets within the clinic, and that master set was secured in a small lockbox in my office to which only I knew the combination. Or so I had thought. What I would learn the next afternoon, sitting at my mother's dining room table, was that the lockbox combination had been written in my mother's hand on a post-it note in my mother's purse for the past 5 months. Because my mother had, at some point in May, used a moment when I was at her house for Sunday lunch to slip into my purse, photograph my keys with her phone, and have a duplicate master set cut at a hardware store in Sandy Springs while she was visiting Colleen. She had then given that duplicate set to Helena. Helena had used those keys to enter the clinic after hours on multiple occasions over the past 5 months to access patient files, billing systems, and the controlled substance cabinet, actions that constitute federal HIPAA violations carrying fines of up to $50,000 per incident. Margaret had documented 17 such after-hours entries on the building's security log. I drove to my mother's house on Thanksgiving afternoon at 4:15. The sky over Ardsley Park was the color of pewter, and the live oaks along Washington Avenue were dropping their last brown leaves onto the hoods of parked cars. I parked across the street. I sat in my car for 2 minutes with both hands on the steering wheel. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. My eyes were clear. My jaw was unclenched for the first time in months. I picked up the bottle of Pinot Noir and the dish of sweet potatoes from the passenger seat, walked up the brick path to the front door, and rang the bell. The brass knocker on the door, the one my mother had polished every Saturday of my childhood, caught the porch light and threw it back at me. My mother opened the door wearing pearls and a navy blue dress and a smile I had been studying my entire life. She kissed my cheek. She said, "There's my hard-working girl." I smiled back. I walked into the foyer. The house smelled the way it always smelled on Thanksgiving, roasted onion and sage and the faint citrus of the cleaner she used on the hardwood floors. I saw Helena standing in the living room with a glass of Prosecco in her hand, laughing at something my mother's neighbor was saying. Her dress was the color of cream. Her earrings were small gold knots that I did not recognize. I saw my sister Colleen across the room, who caught my eye and gave me one small nod. The table was set for 9. Crystal stemware, polished silverware, the good china, the Wedgwood with a thin gold band that my mother had inherited from her own mother, a centerpiece of white roses and eucalyptus that my mother had clearly ordered from the florist on Whitaker Street, place cards in calligraphy. My place card was at the far end of the table, the seat my mother had always assigned me, the seat farthest from the head where she would preside. I had rehearsed this silence for 6 months. I sat down in it now and let it hold me. We sat down at 5:15. My mother said grace. The turkey was carved. The candles in the silver candelabra burned evenly. The chandelier above the table threw small ovals of light into the wine glasses, and when Helena lifted her glass to drink, the light bent and slid down the inside of the crystal like water. Helena, on my right, complimented the cornbread dressing and asked my mother for the recipe. My mother laughed and said it was a family secret. Helena said, "Well, I'm practically family now." My mother reached across the table and squeezed Helena's hand. Colleen, across from me, looked down at her plate and did not move. 40 minutes into dinner, Helena stood up with her champagne flute. She tapped it gently with her butter knife. The sound was small and clear, and it cut through the room the way a needle cuts through fabric. The conversation quieted. My mother set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap. Helena smiled at my mother. She said, "I just want to take a moment to thank Judith for everything, for your wisdom, for your generosity, for making the transition so smooth, to Judith." The glasses lifted. I set my fork down. The cornbread dressing on the tines was still warm. I could feel the warmth through the silver handle in my palm. I said very quietly, "What transition?" The silence that followed has been recorded in my memory with the precision of a film slowed to a single frame per second. My mother's hand to her pearls, Helena's smile freezing, Colleen setting her glass down without a sound, the timer beeping in the kitchen for the pies, the wax of one of the candles sliding a single bright tear down the side of the candlestick and pooling at its base. Somewhere outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. My mother said, "Renee, sweetheart, let's not..." I held up one finger. Just one. She stopped speaking. I had never, in 36 years, asked my mother to stop speaking at her own table. The finger surprised her more than the question had. Her mouth stayed slightly open, the next word visible behind her teeth and unable to find its way out. I reached down to the floor, picked up the leather tote bag I had carried in with me, and pulled out a tablet. I set the tablet on the table next to my plate. The grain of the dining table, walnut, oiled, my mother's pride, caught the screen's glow as I tapped the surface. The display brightened. I said, "Before anyone answers, I want to share something. Margaret Chen, my accountant, has put together a small document I think everyone should see. There are 247 entries. I'll just walk you through the highlights." My mother said, "Renee, this is not the time." I looked at her. I said, "Mom, I'm not asking permission. I'm reading you the receipt." I read them the unauthorized vendor contract that cost the clinic $23,000. I read the date. I read the supplier name. I read the exact penalty line out of the exclusivity clause. Helena's neighbor on her other side, an old friend of my mother's named Eleanor, set her wine glass down very slowly as if afraid of making a sound. I read them Brittany's unauthorized hiring at $62,000. I read the absence of an offer letter. I read the 17 patient double bookings in her first 3 weeks. Helena opened her mouth and made a small sound, half a syllable, and closed it again. I read them the 17 after-hours entries to the clinic using the duplicated master keys that my mother had cut behind my back. I read the dates. I read the times. 11:42 p.m., 2:17 a.m., 4:05 a.m. on a Sunday. I named the federal HIPAA statute and the per-incident fine structure. I let the math settle on the table between the candlesticks. $850,000 at the ceiling. I said the number out loud. My mother's hand, the one not at her pearls, found the edge of the table and held it. I read them the forged equipment lease for $180,000 with my mother's signature where mine should have been. I showed them the scanned page on the tablet, my mother's loops, the small flourish she always put on the W in Whitfield, sitting on a line that belonged to me. Eleanor said, "Judith." very quietly. My mother did not turn her head. I read them the email my mother had sent that said she always does. I read it twice. The second time, I read it slowly, with a pause between the 4 words, and I watched my mother's face the entire time. I watched the small muscle below her left eye twitch once, the way it had twitched when my father's casket was lowered and she had refused, in front of the priest and her sister and 4 of her bridge friends, to cry. I played them the voicemail in which Helena, using my mother's word, had called me the Mule. The audio came through the tablet speaker, tinny and clear, Helena's voice in the room, naming me. I played it twice. The second time, I watched my mother's face. I watched the exact moment her face understood that the word she had used about her own daughter on a porch in Ardsley Park in 1998 had returned to her dining room table on Thanksgiving in the voice of the woman she had recruited to dismantle me. Her chin moved very slightly. Her eyes closed for 2 full seconds and opened again. She did not look at Helena. She did not look at me. She looked at the centerpiece, at the white roses, as if asking them to speak on her behalf. Helena began to speak. "Renee, you have to understand." I held up my hand. I said, "Helena, please don't. There is nothing you can say that is not already documented. I have 100% of what I need." Helena sat down. The Prosecco in her glass was vibrating very faintly because her hand was trembling. A small bead of it slid over the rim and disappeared into the linen tablecloth, leaving a dark spot the size of a dime. Eleanor, across from her, stood up. She said, "Judith, I think I'll," and did not finish the sentence. She picked up her clutch from the back of her chair, walked past the sideboard with the silver tea service, and let herself out the front door. The door closed with the same small click I had heard at every Thanksgiving of my life. 43 seconds passed before anyone spoke. My mother began to speak. "Renee, Renee, please. You have to let me." I turned to her. I said, "Mom, I have known what you thought of me since I was 9 years old. I heard you on the porch. I have spent my entire adult life trying to be valuable enough to be loved by you, and tonight I am done. The clinic dissolution paperwork was filed this morning. My new practice opens Monday. 9 of the 14 staff are coming with me. Margaret has filed a contestation on the equipment lease, and the forged signature exposes you personally to a fraud charge that I have not yet decided whether to pursue. I am leaving now. Do not call me. Do not show up at my home. Do not contact me through Colleen. If you need to communicate with me, you can do it through my attorney." My mother said, "Renee, Renee, baby, please." The word baby was a word she had not used about me in 20 years. It landed on the table like a coin somebody had been hiding in their hand for decades and finally dropped. I did not answer her. I stood up. I put the tablet back in the tote bag. The chair scraped against the hardwood, a small, uneven sound that my mother had always asked her grandchildren not to make. I looked at my sister. Colleen stood up. She set her napkin on her plate, folded once the way our mother had taught us both. She said, "I'm going with her, Mom." My mother made a sound I had never heard her make before. Not a word, not a sentence, something below language, something from a place inside her where she had stored, for 68 years, every feeling she had refused to feel. Helena was still seated, staring at her plate. The yellow ranunculus from the bouquet she had given me that Monday were nowhere in this room, but I could see them anyway, wilted, brown at the edges, in the glass on my desk. Colleen and I walked out of the dining room, through the foyer, past the framed photographs on the wall. Colleen's wedding, Colleen's children, Colleen at Hilton Head, past the small console table where my mother kept her keys in a porcelain dish, out the front door, down the brick path, and across the street to my car. I unlocked the doors. We got in. I started the engine. The dashboard clock said 5:58. Neither of us spoke until we were 3 blocks away. Then Colleen said, "Pull over." I pulled over. She got out of the car. She walked to the curb. She bent forward with her hands on her knees and breathed for about 30 seconds. A man walking a beagle on the opposite sidewalk slowed down, saw her face, and kept walking. She straightened up, got back in the car, looked at me and said, "Drive." I drove. The first 60 days after Thanksgiving were a blur of motion and silence. Motion at the new clinic, which opened the following Monday at 8 in the morning with 17 scheduled patient appointments, patients who had received a letter from me the week before notifying them of the transition and inviting them to follow me to the new location. The waiting room smelled like fresh paint and the lemon polish Yolanda had used on the front desk. The light through the east-facing windows fell on the new wood floor in long, pale rectangles. By the end of the first week, my appointment book was at 92% capacity. By the end of the third week, I had a waiting list. The silence was on the other end. The silence of my phone, which received 17 calls from Helena in a single 4-hour window on the second day after Thanksgiving. Calls I let go to voicemail because the proprietary patient intake algorithm I had built, the one that ran the entire scheduling and triage system at the old clinic, had crashed. Helena did not know the recovery protocol. Nobody at the old clinic did, because I had built it and maintained it and never documented it for anyone but myself. The algorithm could be restored in approximately 40 minutes by someone who knew what they were doing. It would never be restored because the only person who knew what she was doing was no longer answering the phone. By the end of the first month, the old clinic had lost 41% of its patient base. By the end of the second month, 71%. The billing reconciliation system, which I had also built, began generating errors that compounded weekly. Insurance reimbursements were delayed, then denied, then permanently lost. 3 of the 5 remaining staff members resigned. Helena tried to hire a consultant to rebuild the systems and was quoted a 6-figure rebuild over 9 months. She did not have the money. My mother called me every day for the first 3 weeks. I did not answer. She left voicemails. I deleted them without listening. On day 22, she sent a handwritten letter in the mail. I returned it unopened. On day 31, she called Colleen and asked Colleen to ask me to just help them get back on their feet. Colleen said, "Mom, she's not going to, and I'm not going to ask her to." My mother hung up on her. Helena's husband called me once on day 18 from a number I did not recognize. He left a long voicemail explaining that his wife was, in his words, going through a hard time and would I please consider a phone call. I forwarded the voicemail to my attorney and did not respond. The equipment lease contestation was successful. The forged signature was confirmed by a handwriting analyst Margaret had retained, a man in Atlanta who charged $400 an hour and produced a 14-page report. The lease was voided. The equipment company sued my mother personally, and a settlement was reached for an amount I have chosen not to know. In late January, I booked a flight to Costa Rica. 5 days, no phone, no clinic emergencies, no family group chat. I told Colleen I was going, I told Margaret I was going, I told my office manager at the new clinic, a woman named Yolanda I had stolen back from the old clinic, that I would be unreachable from Friday morning until Wednesday afternoon. I packed 1 carry-on bag, I drove to the airport. I flew to San Jose, took a domestic flight to a small coastal town on the Pacific side, checked into a small hotel with white walls and 1 painting of a heron, and walked down to the beach. The sand was black, volcanic, warm under my feet. The grains were larger than I had expected, and they shifted under my weight like something alive. The sky over the water was the color of a peach that had been left on a windowsill. I sat down on the sand. I did not have my phone, I did not have a book, I did not have anything to do or anyone to answer to. The tide was coming in. A pelican was diving offshore. Somewhere down the beach, a woman was laughing. The salt in the air was thicker than any salt I had ever tasted. It collected on my lips and on the inside of my sunglasses. A small green crab moved sideways across the sand 3 feet from my left foot and disappeared into a hole I had not noticed. I sat there for 2 hours and watched the sun go down. I want to tell you what I felt, because I think this is the part that matters most. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel vindication. I did not feel any of the cinematic emotions that the previous 6 months had earned. What I felt instead was something so quiet and so simple that I almost didn't recognize it as a feeling. I felt that nobody needed me to carry anything. That was the first thing. The second thing was that my jaw was unclenched. The third thing was that my hands were warm. The fourth thing was that for the first time in 8 years since my last actual vacation, a long weekend in Asheville that had been interrupted on day 2 by a clinic emergency, I was sitting somewhere and nobody on earth could reach me. The only person whose voice could find me on that beach was my own. I thought about the brass key, the original one, cut at the hardware store on Liberty Street 12 years ago. I had retired it. The new clinic had a digital access system. Codes I controlled, codes I changed, codes that could not be duplicated in a parking lot in Sandy Springs by anyone who claimed to love me. The brass key was in a small wooden box on my dresser at home, sitting on top of a folded handkerchief that had been my father's. I kept it because it reminded me of what I had built. I no longer used it because it reminded me of what I had survived. I sat on that beach until the stars came out. They came out slowly, one at a time, the way they do when you actually have the patience to watch them. I walked back to the hotel. The path was lit by small solar lamps half buried in the sand. I ate a plate of rice and beans and grilled fish on a patio with strings of lights overhead, and I drank 1 glass of white wine, and I went to bed at 9 o'clock and slept 11 hours. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was lie in bed for 10 minutes and listen to the ceiling fan. The blades made a soft tick at the top of each rotation, the way a clock does when its second hand catches on something invisible. I did not check a phone. I did not respond to a text. I did not run a mental list of who needed what. I lay there and listened to a ceiling fan turn in a hotel room in Costa Rica, and I understood that this quiet, this unburdened, unhurried, uninterrupted morning was what every other person in my life had been having all along while I had been holding the harness for them. It is 6 months later now. The new clinic is profitable. Colleen and I talk every Sunday. My mother and I have not spoken since Thanksgiving. I'm told through Colleen that she is in therapy and that she has lost weight and that she has stopped wearing the pearls. Helena's clinic closed in March. Helena's husband filed for divorce in April. I do not celebrate any of these things. I do not mourn them either. They are the weather of a life I no longer live inside. I used to think that loving your family meant carrying whatever they handed you. I was wrong. I thought love and obligation were the same word. They are not. Love is something you give freely to people who are also giving it to you. Obligation is the harness somebody else fastened to your back when you were too small to refuse it. You are allowed to unfasten it. You are allowed to set it down. You are allowed, at 36 or at 56 or at any age the question reaches you, to walk out of the barn and discover that your back was never actually built for that weight in the first place. If someone in your family assigned you a role before you were old enough to refuse it, you are allowed to hand it back. You are allowed to stop being the mule. Comment "not the mule" below if you've ever carried a family that never once asked how heavy it was. I read every one of them. I want to know you're out there. That's the story. One brass key that I no longer carry, one voicemail that returned a word to the woman who first used it, and one black sand beach where I finally heard my own breathing for the first time in 12 years. If any part of this story landed in your chest tonight, if you recognized yourself in the harness or in the planning or in the silence, please share it with one person who needs to hear that the door they're afraid to build is allowed to be built.